I've got the most unhappy topic, I think, of the lot for today on the future of U.S. trade. Let me start with a couple of background comments which lead into it. The first of which is that after World War II, I was always very proud of my country because it led to a system of open multilateral trade. It did not take the usual victor's stance and demand reparations, but instead tried to build a world of an open multilateral trading system, open multilateral financial system through the IMF, and of course even funds for development with the World Bank. The principles of the World Trade Organization, which I am the one going to focus on because it's important for trade, are first off, no discrimination between countries. Once something is coming from abroad, you treat everybody the same way. Secondly, that there's national treatment of anybody within a country, so if you export to the United States and some importer takes you to court in the U.S., you will be treated in the U.S. the same as a national will be treated, no difference for national treatment, and that's important. And the third is really the rule of law, which covers things like tariffs only, because they're something that you can measure, they're transparent. It covers things like how you will deal with various issues in trade. There are rules, for example, under circumstances under which it's possible to say, okay, we have standards on what the health standards for fruit imports should be. Well, we have it, and there has to be a scientific test saying that makes some sense. And by the way, that's still an argument between Europe and the United States, because American scientists say there's no proof that GMO is bad, and the European scientists say there's no proof yet that it's good. So we have a debate there as to which way it is, and that's one of the things, but it's within the rule of law, and that's the way it goes. And there is, and I'll come back to this because it's important, a dispute settlement mechanism which within the WTO, that I think most people knowing anything about trade would agree has been a huge success in the world economy in preventing trade disputes and so on and so forth, and I will come back to it because it's under threat at the moment. The open trading system has served the world very well. It opened up greatly after World War II. At that time, transport and communication still took forever. Transport costs were still estimated about 25% of the value of international shipments. And the average tariff rate on manufactured goods was about 50%. Among the advanced countries, it was even worse than the developing countries. Since that time, trade has opened up in a variety of ways. The rate of growth of exports worldwide of goods and services has been about double that of real GDP until the past few years, and that could be cyclical because it fluctuates a bit. And on top of that, the developing countries began opening up so that they became more important to the system. And importantly, there's really no country that was a poor country after World War II in the Western world that has grown without opening up its trading system over a very long period. You could discover oil or something like that and get a few good years' growth, but that's about it. Otherwise, opening up has been essential for the growth of those countries and important, therefore, for the world. In the period since World War II, as I said, the tariffs among the industrial countries, which applied to all imports from everywhere, of manufacturers fell from about 50% to 3%. Transport costs fell from about 20% on average to about 7%. Okay, so the barrier between countries went way down, and that was one of the factors accounting for the growth of trade, which was an engine for growth of the international economy big time. The trade volume, of course, grew enormously during that period. Now, the European Union was an exception in the sense that it was not open, multilateral, non-discriminatory, and there is provision within the WTO, earlier the GATT, for a preferential trading arrangement, providing that it applies to everything. So tariffs are, and the exact legal wording is substantially zero on all goods imported. Secondly, it has to be, if you agree on a preferential arrangement, all tariffs must be dropped to zero on a specified date. You cannot say we will drop them someday. It has to be done on a specific day. And thirdly, basically, it has to be one where it's uniform across the countries within and without. If it's a customs union, it has to be the same tariffs without, if it's free trade area, only the same tariffs, no tariffs for the members within, but different tariffs without. And that gets important for some things, but I won't go into that here. The European Union was an exception, and for a while, everybody said, look, the EU is a customs union. They're doing so wonderfully, customs unions must work. Well, the Latin American Free Trade Agreement started, the Africans started several, none of them worked. What was the difference? Well, the first big difference was that the European Union dropped its tariffs internationally from an average of about 50% to 3%. and it dropped its tariffs internally from 50% to 0. So it was a difference between a drop of 6%, all the way with only leading to 6%. So which worked? Was it the internal or the external liberalization? Of course it was both. And much of what happened in Europe was because of other things like a mutual recognition of standards and so on, as well as the basic premise. But on the other hand, even the EU was opening up to external trade. At the same time, it was opening up to internal trade a bit more. Okay? So that's important for understanding a lot of what's going on. There were successive multilateral rounds of tariff negotiations for reductions, which only the advanced countries really participated in until 1980, giving the developing countries free rider status because they got the benefit of the tariff reductions without giving many. So everybody says that's free rider. I say the opposite. They lost out because they did not reduce their tariffs, but that's a story for another day. And with that, the multilateral tariff reduction was what did it for the advanced countries. Developing countries didn't do that. But starting about 1980, they began realizing after Korea, Taiwan, and some others had done so well by getting rid of their external barriers, they began cutting down their tariffs and removing most of their import quotas, which were even worse, unilaterally. And the big reduction since the 1980s in trade restrictions worldwide has been among the developing countries that have indeed reduced theirs without the benefit of a WTO agreement. They have not gotten the reciprocity, which is perhaps okay, perhaps not, but it's just a fact of life. Doha round was more complicated. It started, as you know, around 2002. It was complicated even getting it going, and it was complicated afterward. There are a number of reasons, one of which is tariffs were already so low that they were no longer the object, tariffs on goods. Agriculture was an object, and there was a small start on getting some constraints on what you could do to protect agriculture under the Uruguay round. And there would have been more under the Doha round, but that was never completed. Well, the main reason the Doha round wasn't completed was because, of course, the big gains to be had in addition to agriculture were probably in services and in going to non-border restrictions such as different regulatory requirements for the same commodity and things like that, which are much tougher to negotiate internationally. Nonetheless, the international multilateral trading system kept going, and indeed, until about 2010, it would have been a reasonable thing to say that the trend had been downward in protection and somewhat of the increasing integration of goods and services trade in the international economy ever since at least the Second World War. And of course, some before that with transport costs falling and all that. What has changed, of course, is the increasing importance of services over time. So that in the 21st century, as of now and as of 10 years ago, liberalizing services trade would have been brought much greater benefits than any further liberalization, mostly for most countries of goods trade. And liberalizing agriculture would have done more, and for a variety of reasons, mostly political in the case of agriculture, they are harder. So the Doha round stalled and basically was abandoned, which was due primarily to complexity. And free trade agreements, customs unions became a little bit more the flavor of the month in the hope of breaking through some of these complications. But in 2016, as we all know, the United States, which had led the move toward an open multilateral system and had made some small reverses of policy, but not a lot, got a new president who basically does not seem to believe in any trade at all. He basically is a protectionist from start to finish. It's about the only thing on which anybody can find any consistency in his ideas over the economic or the political or the geopolitical sphere. And trade has been the victim of that so far, and that is highly unfortunate, and is clearly the new thing in international trade relations for a variety of reasons. It's the new thing because the U.S. was the leader, and really it required some leadership of somebody to keep the WTO going as it was, and that is certainly gone for the moment, big time. It's new because, in fact, he's done some things that are very harmful to the system. Probably the most harmful is, we won't know until we look later on, of course, but the most harmful is that, as I said, the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO worked very well. Trade is inherently complicated. What is a dispute is because you required 2.5% ethanol on 90%, whereas we required 2.75% on 92%. Is that fair? Is that unfair? Is that discrimination? Da, 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 da. And it gets very legal and very complicated very fast. I once taught an undergraduate class for non-majors in international trade. And it was smart kids. They weren't going to go into economics, and I was doing more policy than theory. And about halfway through the class, there were about 100 in it. I was surprised because normally classes weren't that big there at that time. And halfway through, about half the class said that we want to see you separately after class. I said, fine, what do they want? They all wanted to become international trade lawyers because they found out how much you could do with all of these things. And it's true, it is complicated stuff, which makes it hard to explain. But that said, the dispute settlement mechanism, by almost all accounts, worked very well. It had 7 appointed judges who would form panels, or would be formed. And first there would be basically efforts to resolve the dispute through negotiation, this, that, and the other. Then there would be a decision, and if there was an appeals body. The appellate body was important, so that if you still disputed the decision, you could go there. It was speeded up so it worked more effectively, etc. 7 judges. Every panel had to have 3. 4 have had their terms end already since President Trump took office. The United States has blocked any new appointments for those 4 positions. There are 3 more judges left. Should one of them have to recuse himself for any reason, you can't have a dispute settlement hearing. And meanwhile, 2 of the 3 are supposed to, their term ends, and there's no term renewal as of now, as of December this year. By blocking it, that will be, at least for the moment, the end of the dispute appeals mechanism. And with no appeal, what will happen? The U.S., by the way, has won something like 88% of the cases it has brought. Other countries have won something like 40%. So if you just looked at who gets more out of it, it is not. The rest of the world, it's the U.S. has won more of its disputes. But that seems to have nothing to do with this blockage. The U.S. has said it doesn't like it, has not said what it has wanted. The Canadians, the Europeans, and so on have met trying to come up with a proposal they thought would satisfy the U.S. The U.S. just says that's not satisfactory and keeps on going. And sad to say, that's sort of the basic approach to trade issues in general. Already we have steel and aluminum tariffs, as everybody I'm sure here knows. It is my belief that probably can't stay that way for the obvious reasons. There are some big industries that depend on steel and aluminum inputs, including, in particular, farm machinery, automobiles, et cetera, et cetera. At the moment, the United States producers of those goods are disadvantaged by our trade system because they pay more for those inputs than the Europeans, the Japanese, the Koreans, and so on and so forth. And with our free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, we have kept the tariffs on aluminum and steel for those countries, which makes it even more interesting. So they too have higher costs of inputs than the rest of the world. This is amazing. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. There is to be an announcement by the Trump administration as to what is going to happen in automobiles, and I think the deadline now is May 21st or 19th or something like that for that announcement. I fear that there may be an announcement saying that there has to be something done about that, and so he is going to raise a tariff on autos. Apparently the report that was required by law has come in. One option is a 25% tariff on automobile vehicle imports into the U.S., and of course you can imagine what havoc that will raise in the United States and in the rest of the world. And it is unfortunately a serious threat. There certainly has been begun to build pressure not to have it, and even some Republican senators in Congress have said they will not support this, and it may be something happens, I hope. And in fact, almost the best hope at the moment is that things are so bad that they will have to get better. But in any event, there is that. Now, he is totally inconsistent, and this makes any forecast as to what will happen almost impossible. The first thing he did in entering office, almost the first thing, but certainly on the first day, he rejected the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which had been negotiated with 12 Pacific countries, including Japan, Korea, and so on, which would have had a free trade area there, which would have been greatly to everybody's advantage by almost agreement of everybody. And it included a lot of new issues. And the new issues are ones in which he complains that are not included in trade agreements. And he wants to negotiate all of those trade agreements bilaterally with the countries that he already had it multilaterally, but they've already negotiated a free trade agreement among the 11. He now thinks that's unfair because the United States is not included. It makes no sense. It makes no sense at the time when you name North Korea as your strategic #1 threat, which he did. Then to antagonize the South Koreans by putting 20 quotas on their exports of steel, when the quota rate was set at 70% of the last 3 years average when their steel exports had been growing during that period. So they had to cut back on exports because There are now quotas. Administration of the quotas is turning out to be another disaster. There are 54 different kinds of steel on which quotas are imposed. There are quarterly licensing arrangements under annual licenses. Lots of people, of course, can't plan it that way. And normally, at least from the Pacific, Japan and Korea, both of which are exporters, it takes about 3 months to get something into the U.S., which makes it absolutely amazing. There is worse than that to go, and I could go into that in great detail. But basically, the system there is not working. But once again, we have a mess on our hands. The worst victim is the United States itself, of course, but the rest of the world, unfortunately, is also victimized by it. We then, of course, have our so-called trade war with China, which is a trade war. He has already imposed tariffs on about $200 billion of imports from China. There are about $500 billion altogether, so about 40% of imports from China are now subject to tariffs. The Chinese have retaliated by putting tariffs, or basically stopping importing some things they were importing, like soybeans. Everybody says that's okay because when this is over, things will start. He's taking $12 billion of other funds to recompensate soybean farmers in the U.S. because, of course, the price of soybeans in the U.S. fell, not surprisingly, as a result of this. Meanwhile, the Chinese have signed long-term contracts for soybean imports from Brazil and Argentina and other places. So it is very unlikely that all that business would return, even if something happened. But the soybean farmers in southern Ohio still seem to think he's wonderful. He's a businessman. He knows what he's doing, and we're waiting. Don't tell me why they think that, but that's what they think, and that's what the polls show. So we have a mess on our hands internationally in the trading system, led by the U.S., which is in itself dangerous. President Trump was supposed to meet by the end of March with the Chinese with an agreement. Oh, first by December, but then they postponed to March. Now with March, he's postponed until the end of April. It's almost impossible for the Chinese to do what he says he wants, because what he wants is them to reduce their trade deficit with the United States to zero. Their trade deficit with the United States, of course, is large, but the United States trade deficit with almost everybody is large. And that's because the trade, I'm saying trade, but I mean current account. He means trade. But I mean current account when I say it, but I'll just say trade for shorthand. What he says it's unfair for anybody else to have a trade balance which is negative for the U.S. We're supposed to have balanced trade bilaterally with everybody. Well, of course, what's going to happen instead is even if he gets something with China, and even if they could do it, and cutting your imports from the United States, even for China, would be a big deal to cut them that much. But even if they could do it, other things are going to happen. Like Brazil took the soybeans. You think that that other countries aren't going to be doing some of the things and eating the U.S. lunch in some of these regards? Of course it is. There's absolutely no doubt about it that that's what's going to happen if he gets his way. But meanwhile, how the Chinese can do it, there's only one way. They can order their state enterprises to buy goods from the U.S. whether those enterprises want to or not. But a second condition is he wants to cut the power of the state enterprises, and they're supposed to do less. How do you do both? Meanwhile, he says he has to get exports from the United States up. He is criticizing harshly things like the closing of a GM plant and so on and so forth. And he's beginning to get into the micromanagement of economics, which we always thought in the United States couldn't happen. And one of the problems with trade is you can favor individual companies, and unfortunately, he has tried to do it. There is now some pushback. GM just announced the other day that they will not do anything to a plant, which they have announced would be closed, and which he has said should not be closed. So that's happening. So there are all kinds of things like that going on. And the closer you look at it in the United States, and the closer you are to it, the worse it looks. It is not something that is something only from Europe. And in fact, I would venture to guess that the biggest damage, if this continues very long at all, will be to see a continued reduction in productivity growth for reasons other than we talked about already. There's something else going on here, and it is very bad. He's blocked the dispute settlement mechanism, as I said. There are inconsistencies everywhere. The steel thing is inconsistent between countries. He's tripping over himself between things he has agreed with in the NAFTA, the new NAFTA, which is something else which I can't pronounce. U.S., Mexico, Canada, USMCA. You tell me how to pronounce that and I'll do it, but I can't. So I'll call it NAFTA. Anyway, it's unchanged except for raising rules of origin in Mexico for autos. Guess what the new rule of origin is? Oh, and I should tell you first, the Mexican average hourly wage in manufacturing is $4 an hour. In the U.S., it's 21. His condition for Mexico getting into the free trade agreement with the United States is that the average wage paid has to be $16 an hour minimum, 4 times the minimum wage, and well, of course, above anything that can possibly be afforded. Now, There is only a 2.5% tariff on tariffs, and the Mexicans will surely, if that's the case, import under the non-free trade agreement, namely the 2.5%, right? Why do I think there's going to be an auto tariff? Can you guess? Makes sense, I think. And the trouble is, the making sense is not something he's good at, so maybe he won't do what makes sense, which will make the economics worse for the U.S., but better for everybody else. In other words, to say what's going to happen next in trade is as unpredictable as what he's going to do on anything else, which is bad for business, it's bad for the economy, especially since he does seem to think he can order companies around. And it's, of course, bad for the world. My best hope is that the rest of the world begins to appreciate what was there and perhaps picks up some of the slack, and that meanwhile some of the chaos in the U.S. will be reversed either because there's such obvious and visible dislocation on account of it, or because something happens in the 2020 election. Thank you.